Humble respect to Guru Mahan, Guru Pirancio Sankaran, Guru Piranyo, fellow Jnanis. Okay, so let's continue Mahan's teachings, this ninth principle. This is part 2 of the ninth principle on fire. And I spoke about fire here, started from the primordial atom. And an element, a part of that fire, or the primordial atom that gave rise to everything in this universe, is gravitational force. And I'm going to talk about the gravitational force in the context of physics, but also in the context of how it is relevant in that spiritual perspective. So let's first ask, what is gravity, right? Why did Swamiji give emphasis to gravity and gravitational force? And the hint to that is that everything in this universe is imprinted by energy and electromagnetism and all this, and it gives this push and pull forces, the forces that gives you cause and effect. And because of this, you see that everything in this entity has that imprint. And because everything in this universe, every entity in this universe has that imprint, including our body, including our mind, including the way we think, including the way we behave, our actions, everything in this universe, from the energy right up to the electrons and the protons and the quarks and the molecules and everything, and more complex beings. And you see that, how do we know this force that is weaving everything together? And how is it that we don't see it? And what is it that we need to do to experience these subtle forces? And what are the benefits of being aware of the subtle forces? And this is what I want to walk through with you today. So what is gravity? Gravity is nothing but, it's a force by which all planets and everything in this object centers around. So there is a force that enables planets, galaxies, everything that goes in orbit. And this is the nature of our universe. So we start off with the Big Bang, we start off with galaxies, we start off with nebulas, we start off with even our own solar system. We look at our own planet, even our planet is in orbit. And as you go at a more micro level, at the atomic levels, you see that within the atoms, you have nucleus. Around there, you have electrons and all those things. As you go deeper and deeper, that imprint of nature is in everything. So Swamiji, this is a quote from NASA that says that the force of gravity keeps all planets in orbit around the sun. Now here, there are not just our sun. There are, millions and billions of suns, but all this is, orbiting around that primordial Big Bang that gave rise to that expansion. So that is the macrocosm. At the micro level, we also see that in our own biology, this happens. We call it, various names. So again, at the micro level, we have this. But we also see this imprint in our own mind, how thoughts begin, how the thoughts interconnect, how it forms itself, and then it emerges, it sustains for a while, it dissolves. Again, it starts. And we see this process imprinted in us. So we see that, the cycle of life orbits around a very important sun that I will talk about, and that sun is none other than our own consciousness, right? That's how the Big Bang gave rise to everything. Everything is centered around that. That's how the nebulas and the galaxies have the center that gives it that orbit. In that same way, we all have a center that gives us that orbit that is around us. How harmonious that orbit is, or how harmonious the planets or the things around us, our interaction, depends very much on how the strength of that sun and how it permeates to every facet of the planets and how the planets react to. So that harmony is really crucial. And this is what in Mahan's I God philosophy brings that entire microcosm and macrocosm together. And he says this, Yipparamum apparamum ega paraparamum innum nanadente. He says, so etada tatparathai etti utpurumaya uttu nokku Yipparamum apparamum ega paraparamum innum nanadente. He says that by observing things very, very carefully, I observe that what is in the macrocosm is imprinted in the microcosm, vice versa. When I understand the dynamics and I'm aware of it, I become that. And I'll show you that in a more systematic way. So what this says is that this is our galaxy, and it's centered around the sun that we have. Without the sun, none of the planets would be in orbit. And each of those planets also have its own gravitational force that, so it's a push and pull force. So Newton discovered all the formulas behind this. Those who are very interested can look at all the Newton's law, the Newtonian, and so on, Newtonian physics. So clearly we see that, due to the above, Earth gets its gravitational force from everything in this universe. It has, in its own core, it's got the core that moves around, that gives the gravitational force. It is also interacts with all the gravitational force of the sun and the planets, and that's how we got this beautiful orbit, right? So we see that, the imprint of this gravity is in Earth, and we also see that the imprint of the gravity is in our blood, our blood that moves through the veins. It's also due to gravity, and we see that, although the taller you are, we see that the heart pumps the blood around us, right? So we see that, the heart and the movement of the blood is all due to the dynamics of the gravitational force. Our Earth's surface is about 9.8 meters per second, the gravitational force. And that has an impact on our blood, the way the blood moves, and also the body. Our own physiology is impacted by gravitational force. I'll give you an example. When we are on Earth and gravity is pulling us, gravity has a force that pulls us, and we are standing against gravity, right? Whenever we do something against gravity, you need to counter-react the gravity's force with your bodily force. When you do that, the body needs to have muscles that can counter-react the gravity. So the more you counter-react the gravitational force, your muscle starts building. And what the muscles do is it stores potential energy. So every time you carry weights, so every time you walk up the mountain, so every time you do things, all your exercises and everything, you are now counter-reacting the gravitational force, the blood flow. And that's why you see that the blood flow intensifies, it starts forming muscles and so on. And some parts of the body needs to exert more forces to counter-react that gravitational force. And another important thing also happens is that when astronauts go to space, when they beat gravity and gravity is not there, the gravitational force is not there on the body, right? So two things happen when we are on the Earth. One is muscles form. The other one is our bone density also becomes intensive and strong. Our bones become strong because the bones now need to hold on to, pushing the force, and the bones become very strong. But in space, because gravitational force is not there, we see that the blood flow changes, and interestingly, we are not counter-reacting. We don't need the forces to counter-react gravity. We start losing muscles, and our bones also starts becoming more and more less dense and become more brittle. That is why you see that astronauts need to do a lot more exercise while in space. And so we see that gravity is very important to keep the muscles in the body fit, particularly if you do a lot of exercise. If you don't do exercise and you just do nothing, you see that over time, your muscles will start withering away. You start getting osteoporosis and all those things. So this is where exercise, yoga is very important to keep the body and the blood flow. In that same way, we see that our mind is also impacted by gravitational force, a different type of gravitational force. One is, of course, the physiology, the body. If the body is healthy, the mind is healthy. The blood flow enables, the neural connectivity and all those things. So that is why it's very important to walk or, do exercise and so on. So the first part is that the physiology of the brain also needs the nourishment of that blood and so on. That is why even Mahan also says that, look, eat healthy, do exercise, But the second aspect of this is actually the mind. The mind has a different type of gravitational force. The mind has, like how the body has push-pull forces, the mind too has a push-pull forces. The things that we like, we try to embrace and want more of it, and the things that we don't like, we push. So we have this gravity of push and pull in our own mind. Part of it is also because of the physiology, but also part of it is because of the way we generate thoughts, the type of thoughts that we nurture, how we interact, and all those things. So if our thoughts are very superficial, you see that our mind is not very deep. If we intensify our introspection, contemplation, reflection, and meditation, we understand the gravitational force of this material world. We are able to withstand some of the challenges, and we are able to counter-react with, positivity, transforming scars into stars, impossible things that we cannot do becomes I am possible. So it's the counter-reacting to that gravitational force of the sukha and dukkha. And ultimately, we see that like how the body comes to a stage of equilibrium, that it is able to counter-react the Earth's gravity. It forms enough muscles. When you have enough muscles, you can do things, more easily. You become more agile and so on. In that same way, when the mind is able to harness this force, that means like how the muscles, the body harnesses gravitational force to build muscles and blood flow better. In that same way, when the mind is able to harness the sukha and dukkha through deep introspection, contemplation, reflection, and meditation. So one hand, we see that the body builds its muscles because of exercise, yoga, deep breathing, eating good food, all those things, and having good sleep. In that same way, the counterpart of the mind also is that it needs nourishment. What is the nourishment for the mind? It needs to introspect, contemplate, reflect. It has to meditate. The mindfulness is how the muscle is full of energy. The mind needs to be full of its own inner source of resources and the soul force, or the divine force. The mind also needs to cultivate, like how we eat good food. The mind needs to be able to access knowledge that are eternal, and understand the transitory knowledge. So it needs eternal knowledge and contemporary knowledge, things that are continuously changing. So the mind needs the practice of viveka and vairagya. Viveka means the ability to sift off what is real and unreal, and vairagya is to be like space, neither attached nor detached. So when you're neither attached nor detached, you're able to see things with greater clarity. So there are two types of gravitational force. One is physical, that impact our physiology and our brain. The other one is actually the thoughts and the experiences that have an impact on our mind, that also has a different type of gravitational force. So we see that, our physiology is impacted by this. This is why we see that, when we start this introspection, contemplation, reflection, meditation, that quiet time is very important. Taking deep breath, filling your body and your lungs with a lot of oxygen that gives nourishment, the calmness, the coolness, in that process. We see that why 4:30 to 6, that is the time the body has good rest, and you take the deep breath in the morning, the body has had good rest, the brain has cleared all the toxins. When the blood flow goes through, you see that you get a sense of calm, serenity, and so on. So we see that, these are some of the steps that are very important to withstand, understand, and be aware of all the forces that impact us in our mind. So this is an example that shows, I want to go a little bit more deeper. And you see the sun and we have planets, and it seems that there is a force that guides it. But what keeps that all intact, which we don't see and we are not aware of it, is something called space. So we live in a universe where we have space, which is three-dimensional, and time. So our eyes cannot see space because it's so subtle, but yet it is there, right? In that same way, that space, it's what Einstein called the fabric of space that keeps it together. And because it's got mass, it's dense the space. And this is how gravitational forces, comes, because both space-time continuum is very important. So there's the interaction between all the planets because of that fabric of space. And this has got a very important spiritual dimension that great saints and sages have spoken about. So we see this, that although we see that there is gap between the planets, but our eyes cannot cognize because we want to see something physical. Our frequency does not enable us to see physically space. We see things in space, but to see the fabric of space, we can't use our senses. So we need to go to a much more subtler, experience. So, and this is the fabric of our Earth. So we see that our Earth is there. It has got a rotation. You've got, the moon, and it's all interconnected by that fabric called space that so while we may see separate, when we go out and see the moon, wow, it looks separate. But at a more subtle level, the moon and the Earth are interconnected through this thing fabric called space. And there's the electromagnetic field, the gravitational force that keeps it in orbit, in that same way as how all the planets. So what our eyes does not see doesn't mean it's not there. There is an interconnectivity between, all the planets, and it's connected by this fabric called space. Right? So now I want to go into much more deeper analysis. So we're going to zoom down to our own. So we see that our Earth has a rotation, and the rotation is because of its core and how it interacts with everything else in the universe. So everything so our Earth is impacted by this gravitational force of all entities from the sun to all the other planets, right? And everything on Earth also is impacted by the gravitational force that is within the Earth. So the closer you are on the surface of the Earth, you get about 9.8 meters per second. The further you go, you see that the gravitational force changes, right? So when we go to a different altitude, the gravitational force changes, and you see that the dynamics of our body changes, the pressures around, changes, and that has an impact. So that is why we see that, when we go fly in the aeroplane 30,000 feet, the pressure changes, and that changes our own physiology. If we don't pressurize the cabin, our body will find it very hard. So we see that, there's an interconnectivity between the Earth and everything in this universe, and everything on Earth is also interconnected. So in our entire cycle of life, from the time conception to being a baby, being a child, a teenager, going through our lives, having our own families and getting old, and ultimately, body slowly disintegrating, getting disease, and ultimately we attain samadhi. Everything revolves around our Earth that is interconnected with this gravitational force, this push, pull, spin force. And this is what we call cycle of life, right? As how everything starts and sustains for a while and dissolves. It is because of this inner force that enables, the orbits, creation, sustenance and dissolution. So everything in this universe, which is matter and energy related, will go through this transformation. Galaxies, nebulas, everything, including our own biology. So this is the nature of this universe, right? And there's time built in. Can you imagine if there's no time, what happens, right? So we see that, the cycle of life is tied to this gravitational force, everything that's interconnected, right? And we experience this. So all our experiences are tied around this. So is there a way? So it is tied to our earthly things, everything that we do, every thought, every experience, including our dream, is all related to our material experience. Can anybody say that I dream about nothing? That it cannot be a dream. It's absolute silence, right? But we often dream about things such as, people, places, events, everything that is tied to this cycle of life, right? So entire cycle of life is being animated by subtle force. And this gravitational force of Sukha, Dukkha, push and pull forces, and all those things that happens in our life, the things that we like, the things that we don't like, it's based on our bodily physiology. It's also based on our DNA of our mind, and all these things cycles, arguments, enemies, good friends, relationships, good relationships, divine relationship, toxic relationship. All these are tied to the cycle of life, right? That is push-pull forces that nature's embedded in everything, in our physiology. So like a scientist, you say, hey, these things are all moving, and I don't know why this is happening. So through deep scientific inquiry, they realize that this movement is due to some subtle things that in our nature, space, time, all those things. So these great scientists have discovered there are more things than what our eyes can see. In that same way, Mahans and all the great saints too say that as how the scientists use telescope, to see the entire, spectrums and things that are keeping intact, which our normal eyes don't see, or the scientists that see, hey, people are getting sick and there must be microbes and things. So they use the microscope to see the minute things that, our eyes cannot see, to discover there's an entire micro universe out there that is mutating and going through the same cycle of life, that creates bacteria, viruses, amoeba, everything else. So there's a macrocosm, there's a microcosm. But the great saints and sages, they combine the microscope principle and the telescope principle to create something called the inner scope. The inner scope, this is the yoga, yug. And they use that same, lens that created the microscope and the telescope to create this inner scope to take that journey within themselves. And they realize that, aha, there is this forces that creates all these mutations or galaxies to come together and, break up. In that same way, there are forces of the mind that is interacting with this material world that is creating this push-pull forces in that mind. And if we understand that, then is there another dimension that we can attain, that transcendental, that stepping away and not being impacted by this sukha dukkha push-pull forces. And they step back and they observe. This is what I call the introspection, contemplation, reflection, meditation. That's the inner scope that I'm talking about, right? And so, they said this, how do we transcend this sukha dukkha push-pull, what we call the karmic forces? The karmic forces is the cause and effect forces. They said that means that we have to get to a space, a dimension that is transcendental to this push-pull karmic forces. And this space is what Swamiji calls a universal peace sanctuary, a sanctuary that is transcendental to all this. And this is how we see that this whole process of mindfulness and meditation comes, right? Says, instead of letting our senses all go out and interact with this material world and pick up all the vibrations, let's now, channel all that to go deep within, ourselves. So there must be a substratum that is how you see the fabric of space and time, is governing everything in this universe. That same space and time, which is, amazing, can create many, many things, must be passing through me too, as how it passes through every entity, every sun, everything. That's how it's created the suns to power all the planets and the galaxies. There must be this fabric that is passing through me, that is creating this sun that gives me consciousness or awareness. And everything centers around this sun, this Jyoti, this Paranjyoti in all of us. So that is now becomes the focus. How do we discover this center in us? The center cannot be discovered through dissipating our force out there. It requires concentration, it requires intensity, it requires deep understanding of the inner forces within us. We can call that anything, call that God, call that divinity, call that soul, we can call all that. So the center of everything, the epicenter of my own existence is not out there. It must be within me. And this is what the mindfulness, the mind must be full of everything in the universe, including the universe itself, right? And this is the journey that the great saints and sages have taken, like how the scientists have discovered from the Newtonian, and he listed down all the principles behind that Newton's law, and is able to calculate beautifully the orbit. So using that, they can predict when the sun comes up, when the moon comes up, when all those celestial things that takes place. In the same way, Einstein and others discovered, from quantum mechanics to relativity, so they can now see, there is the whole gravity is because of the fabric of, space and time. And through that, they were able to discover many, many things, secrets of the universe. In that same way, the Mahans and others, through this scientific inquiry, they were able to discover that fabric of the universe is passing through us. And if we're able to understand it, we're able to harness the forces of this universe within all of us. The awareness, so that discovering that sun within all of us. And this is how Mahan then said, okay, I have to find a mode to get to that abode, that sun that is being spoken about in the Gayatri mantra, the sun that is spoken about in all the great scriptures, the Holy Spirit that gives us illumination and enlightenment, that is spoken about by all the great masters and scriptures. It's theoretically there, conceptually there, but it has to be experiential. And this is where he said, Arivin, Arival, Arivin Telivrit. He says that the theology needs to be transformed into experiential practice and impact. And this is how he started this journey of wanting to feel that vibration, the resonance of that universe, the Kundalini. Kundam is the vessel that the power or the force is passing through and animating it. And through this, he was able to discover a simple technique, like how the scientists have used the telescope and microscope. He used that inner scope called the Kundalini meditation method. His 3-step method to be able to quieten the mind down, for the mind to be able to get more subtle forces that are weaved through across the entire universe, that is holding and enabling the harmonious move of the earth, the harmony in everything in this universe, including everything within us. So that Kundalini force, the Kundalini practice, was his scientific discovery. It has been spoken about in all the great scriptures, from Yoga Vasishtha Ramayana to every great saints and sages have spoken about this inner resonance, not just in the Hindu scriptures, but also in all the other theologies that has been spoken about. So this Grand Master has shown a simple technique to get there, right? Within 21 days, one gets this vibration, the resonance, this Bhagavan's Gita. So through this practice, something very interesting happens. The mind now, which is the animator of this entire material existence, become transcendental. It now steps out of the body. I wouldn't say, the best way to say is it now becomes more integrated and is able to pick up the forces of the universe that animates everything. And you see that the body The mind becomes transcendental. That is why, he says that etada tatparate etti etti utparama utru utru noku noku iparama aparamam ega paraparamam. The entire cosmos, I've attained it within me. I've attained the entire cosmos within me. So at that stage, as one practices meditation, you see that the material world quietens down, and suddenly you start feeling that universal vibration that is weaving everything together. You start feeling the subtle, powerful unarvu or vibration. And you see that you start transcending from that bodily experience, the space-time continuum, to that more higher dimensional space. Ultimately, you actually, sometimes you don't feel the space and time, somewhat like what in the deep sleep state where everything disappears. Here, everything, the material bodily experience, space-time continuum disappear, but you're aware of it. The mind says, aha, this is something very interesting. In sleep, the material mind is not there. But in deep meditation, the material mind gets glimpses of this. And over time, the material mind sheds itself to embrace this universal mindset. So this takes time. So we see that this meditational process, this Mahan, is the inner scope, the discovery that he has made to be able to transcend that bodily space-time continuum. And one gets that oneness. Wow, that Mahan says, Summa irukum sugam, that beautiful, transcendental, universal peace sanctuary that one gets, that oneness. You feel connected. Any thought you're able to connect to this, you see, and you get much more deeper understanding of life. Life is not something frivolous or desires are something that you should shun. You divinize it, you connect it, you raise it to become more and more enriched and enlightened. And when one continues this, you see that the gravitational forces that from the material world that animates the material world, beneath that gravitational material, experiences and so on, there is something far greater, which is more universal, that weaves everything together. It reminds me of, there's a nice song that I heard on, and it says that, they call the Japa Mala. Japa Mala is actually the beads that we use for prayers, right? In every religions, they have it. We count the beads. The beads are all our orbits, all the satellites in our orbits, all our experiences. But what weaves everything together in the center, which we don't see, is actually the thread. So in that same way, there is this thread, that weaves all our material experiences, everything that is material, and that weaving, that force that is also passing through us. And we are part of that. Our own, conscious state is also integrated with the broader, forces and divine forces. So through this meditational process, one gets that oneness, one becomes aware of the subtle forces, and one ultimately becomes one with the universe. This is why we say universal outlook. Your mind starts transforming from being very, narrow, it becomes more expanded. And this is beautifully captured in many, many scriptures. And one who practices Mahan's meditation or other meditation will actually feel that oneness, that connectedness. And when one gets that connectedness, one attains that transcendental. You're not affected by this push-pull forces. Yes, the body goes through it, but your mind learns to decouple from that push-pull forces. It becomes transcendental, right? So ultimately, the forces of, when we say your transcendental karmic forces, neither past nor future. They're not talking about past, present, future. They're talking about the cause and effect forces. You're not impacted by it. The mind becomes a sense of silence, serenity, and the mind becomes simple, right? Because it's discovered the force that threads everything. There's no complexity. That is what drives everything. Life may be complex, but when you unpack the complexity, you see that actually what is weaving everything is this. So this is the grand theorem of everything, and that everything is passing through us. And if we are able to understand this grand theorem of everything, then we can create anything we want. So this is what Swamiji's teaching is, and this gravitational force. When I was practicing meditation, started getting this vibration in the early stage. As it went deeper and deeper, that understanding, but one needs to take the time and trouble to see why this is happening, how this is happening, understand the principles behind this, and ultimately you understand there are some grand principles that governs this universe, governs our body, governs the concept of God in the way, you know, enlightened people describe, and governs every facet of our lives. So we see that this mindfulness and meditation is critical in helping us understand things better in life. And that ultimately, not just in the transcendental state of meditation, as we get that glimpses of that during meditation, and the mind starts recalibrating and saves that memory there and brings it out in every state of our awareness. While meditation, while sleeping, and that is why you see that I'm sure all of you all have had a sleep, but you have not asked the question, what happens in deep sleep? Where am I in deep sleep? So when you are in the deep meditation state, when you say, hey, something is happening here, and I'm starting to get these glimpses. So what happens in deep sleep state? You understand what the deep sleep state means. And then you ask the question, how do I channel this while I'm interacting in this material world? You know, being the state of silence, being the state of serenity, being the state of simplicity, finding solutions very, very easily to the life's challenges. So the transcendentality carries through in every facet of life, because the fabric of that transcendentality is weaving everything. That's what powers everything. And if we understand that, whether we are waking up in the morning, having our breakfast, we are connected. Whether we are speaking to our spouse, we are connected. And you see that our speech, our appreciation of the breakfast becomes more solid, you know. When I eat the muesli in the morning, I can feel the grain more solid, you know. When I eat the raisins, I can feel the sweetness of nature, you know. When I take that milk, I can feel the nourishment of that, you know, the milk and all its full nutrition. So the mind becomes so attuned to see that oneness in the breakfast that you're having, the interactions that you're having with your spouse or children. It becomes more meaningful, more deeper, more harmonized. The same thing when you go to the office, your mind is always connected to what you're doing, and that blooms. The same thing with every facet of our lives, until when you go to sleep, you say, you know what? I am in the connected state. I am going back. I interact in the world in the connected state. In my meditation, I'm connected. In my interaction of the world, I'm connected. In my deep sleep, I'm connected. I am transcendental. So you see that the mindset becomes more and more universal. So to summarize this push-pull forces, one really need to understand, where do I start? So the summary is that I've covered quite a lot of materials here, but I want to take you through step by step of understanding this concept, right? So a summary of this universal mindset is understanding the forces of nature that governs us. So the first thing is that understand the space and time, right? Our material world really well. This first step is really understanding our material world really well. And this is why Swamiji says, study science and you'll understand what my philosophy is. You don't have to study all the equations, but at least have an understanding of your body and how time and space and things around you impact you. And you need to understand that everything around you impacts you. The impact depends very much on how powerful your mind is to withstand that, transform that, integrate it, assimilate all the forces into the, a combustion for our own enlightenment. So this is the first step of understanding nature really well. The second thing is that practicing that meditation. So once you understand the forces of nature, try to discover the forces of nature within all of us. It is embedded naturally in us. So nurture the natural nature to discover that nature is part of us, right? So that is the second part. devote time for meditation. You cannot afford not to do it, right? As how we cannot afford not to brush our teeth before we, meet anyone. In that same way, it is more important to practice meditation than brushing your teeth, you see, because you ornament your mind more importantly than ornamenting the body. So when people say, I've got no time for meditation, no time for this, no time for that, I am sorry that, you would not be able to discover this oneness. You would not be able to unlock the full potential of who you are. So meditation, the mindfulness is very important. The second, if you are able to do this, you would get that oneness. You'd get that everything becomes that universal peace energy that Swami is talking about, becomes a reality. God is no more an abstract concept. God becomes one with you. You see, this is the I God philosophy, And, if you have God with you, what else do you need in this world, right? So this mind becomes very powerful. And when you do that, you become transcendental to the things around you. You're not impacted by poverty. You're not impacted by disease, ridicule, whatever, you become, like the Paramahamsa, like the swan, right? Okay, the body goes through changes. Yeah, I've got to cope. My mind will recalibrate to cope with the body. Okay, the mind, the body may get diabetes or heart disease or all those things, right? Yeah, we cope with it. We do our best to look after the body, exercise, and ultimately the body at some point will have to start disintegrating. This is the nature of the body. Every flower starts off with a bud, it blooms, and has to wither away. This is part and parcel of this, but the mind can be transcendental to it. So you age gracefully, and ultimately when the time comes to exit, we are not afraid of it. The transition becomes smooth. So this is the fourth step of that transcendental, glimpses of the transcendental. And finally, we have the transcendentality. That means we are connected. The gravitational force is core to us. We are the epicenter of everything. The sun that is orbiting, that all the planets are orbiting, the sun in us will be the core and the center that everything else orbits around. And everything else is powered by the inner sun. And when the inner sun has got the divine, beautiful resonance and harmony, everything around us will resonate in the same frequency. This is what we call samadhi, sama-adi, or the samatvalana. And this is what Swamiji always says, sandosam. The word he used, sandosam, it means glad. Actually, there's a beautiful meaning to that word sandosam. Santam means that sense of, the word first part is santam. Santa means a sense of tranquility, serenity, and when the mind is tranquil, serene, you see that in silent, it is able to overcome all the dosam. Dosam is all the challenges in life and negativity and so on. And you see that that can only happen when one understands the forces of nature, and the epicenter of all the forces of nature starts with us. We stop pushing and pulling. We attain this beautiful state of equanimity or samatva, where the centrifugal force and centripetal force are balanced. If we are able to do that, we are able to live a beautiful, inspirational, and universal life. Life becomes an awesome journey. We don't see the limitations. Everything becomes limitless. Everything, the finiteness transformed to infiniteness. So with that, I hope you have a better appreciation of the forces that governs this universe and the forces that are weaved into all of us, and we are able to unlock these forces to live a purposeful, meaningful, powerful, and impactful life. Santosham.